The midday sun beat down on the busy square where pedestrians shuffled between shops and cafes, their faces buried in their phones or preoccupied with conversations. Henry Carson, standing near the fountain, straightened the worn collar of his jacket and scanned the scene, feeling the weight of every one of his 90 years. It was a day like any other, but something about the energy in the square felt different, more restless. Suddenly, the chatter around him turned into hushed whispers, and Henry realized why. A group of young men, no more than their early 20s, had gathered at the corner. Their laughter was loud, and their voices carried over the square like a storm brewing. Henry had seen them before, rowdy, disrespectful, the type that paid no attention to people like him. He tried to move away, but before he could take a step, one of the men, a lanky figure with tattoos snaking up his arms, spotted him. "Hey, old man!" the young man shouted, his friends immediately turning their attention to Henry. Henry froze. He could feel every pair of eyes in the square on him, waiting, watching. "What are you doing out here? Shouldn't you be in a home or something?" The young man smirked as he walked toward Henry, his friends trailing behind, amused by the show. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't been in a confrontation in years. He wanted to speak, to tell the young man to show some respect, but the words caught in his throat. The man stepped closer, too close, and grabbed the hat from Henry's head. "What's this? A relic from the Stone Age?" His friends erupted in laughter, their voices echoing across the square. Henry stood there, humiliated, his hands trembling. The man tossed the hat back at him, smirking, and turned away, the group's laughter growing louder as they walked off. The crowd that had gathered said nothing, only watching in silence. Henry bent down slowly, picking up his hat, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric. He stood up, his back straightening despite the ache in his bones. He glanced around the square one last time before turning and walking to the bench near the fountain, feeling a deep, cutting loneliness he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the humiliation that stung. It was the silence of the crowd, their unwillingness to step in, to say anything, to help. Henry sat down heavily on the bench, staring at the hat in his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly invisible. Just as he was about to leave, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Mind if I sit?" Henry looked up, startled. Standing before him was a man, maybe in his late 30s, his face kind but weary. Henry nodded, and the man sat beside him, offering a small, understanding smile. "I saw what happened," the man said softly, glancing in the direction of the young men. "That was wrong." Henry didn't respond at first, unsure of what to say, but something about the man's presence felt different. He wasn't just a bystander. He had chosen to sit with Henry when no one else had. The man extended his hand. "Name's Mason. You?" Henry looked down at the man's hand, hesitating for a moment before shaking it. "Henry." Mason leaned back on the bench, his eyes on the fountain. "I've had a rough few months myself. You wouldn't believe the things I've been through." Henry remained silent, his mind still on the incident. But as Mason began to talk, something inside Henry shifted. Maybe, just maybe, the stranger was the ally he didn't know he needed. And so, a conversation began, one that would change both their lives. The hum of the fountain seemed to fade as Henry sat on the bench, Mason's voice a low murmur in the background. His mind was far away, drifting back through the decades to a time when the world looked different, when he looked different. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Henry stood tall, respected by his peers, his back unbowed by age. He had lived through wars, seen the rise and fall of governments, and had been part of building a nation. He wasn't just an old man in a square. He was Henry Carson, a name that used to mean something. He closed his eyes, and the memories rushed in, vivid and clear. He could see himself as a young soldier, standing in the barracks with his comrades. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that only men going off to war could understand. They were brothers back then, bound by a shared purpose, their youthful faces hardened by the gravity of what lay ahead. He had seen it all, the battles, the losses, the victories. He had carried his fallen friends back from the front lines, his uniform soaked with the weight of their sacrifice. The medals on his chest were reminders of those days, though he rarely wore them now. It wasn't the medals that mattered, not anymore. It was the stories behind them, the lives lost, the friendships forged, the lessons learned. Henry's thoughts wandered to his post-war years. He had returned home a changed man, like so many others. He built a life from the ground up, marrying the love of his life, Evelyn, and raising 2 children, Michael and Susan. He had worked hard, owning a small hardware store in town where people respected him for his integrity and honesty. But life moved fast, and time had a way of slipping through your fingers without you noticing. His children grew up, moved away, and built families of their own. Evelyn, his anchor, passed away 10 years ago, and without her, the house felt emptier than ever. The store had long since closed, and the town he once knew had changed, filled with new faces and new ways. The respect he once commanded had slowly faded, replaced by indifference, or, worse, pity. It wasn't just the years that had weighed on him. It was the isolation. The world no longer saw him as a man who had lived through history, who had given his all. They saw only his frail body, his slow steps, and his gray hair. The Henry Carson of yesterday was buried beneath layers of time, hidden from view, even from himself. "Henry?" Mason's voice broke through his reverie. Henry blinked, returning to the present. He glanced at Mason, who was watching him with a curious expression, as if he could sense the weight of Henry's thoughts. "You okay?" Mason asked, his tone soft, almost respectful. Henry nodded slowly, his voice a little hoarse when he finally spoke. "Just thinking." Mason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, I've been going through a lot lately. Lost my job, went through a messy divorce, and it feels like everything's falling apart. But after seeing what happened to you today, I realized maybe I don't have it as bad as I thought." Henry studied Mason's face, noticing the shadows beneath his eyes, the subtle slump in his shoulders. He wasn't just saying that to be polite. Mason had his own burdens to bear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared by people who understood that life didn't always play out the way you wanted it to. Henry cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "I'm sorry about what happened to you. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, does it?" Mason gave a half smile. "No, it doesn't." Henry leaned back, staring at the fountain again. "You know, I used to be somebody in this town. Fought in the war, ran a business, raised a family. But now, I'm just that old man those kids picked on today." Mason's expression hardened. "You're more than that, Henry. I saw what they did, and I've been thinking. There's no way they should have gotten away with it." Henry waved a hand, dismissing the thought. "It's not the first time something like that's happened. Won't be the last." "But it shouldn't happen at all," Mason said firmly. He hesitated, then added, "Look, I know we just met, but I think you deserve better than this. People need to know who you really are." Henry chuckled bitterly. "Who cares? No one's interested in the past anymore. I'm just a ghost to them." Mason shook his head. "You're not a ghost, Henry. You're a legend. And I'm going to help people see that." Henry raised an eyebrow. "How do you plan to do that?" Mason's eyes gleamed with determination. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to make sure that the next time those punks see you, they'll regret ever laying a hand on you." Henry couldn't help but smile, though it was small. He didn't know whether Mason was serious or just trying to make him feel better. Either way, it was nice to know that someone cared, even if only for a moment. The 2 men sat in silence for a while longer, the noise of the square continuing around them, though it seemed more distant now. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mason stood up, dusting off his jeans. "I'm heading back home, but I'll be seeing you again, Henry. You have my word." Henry looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Mason." Mason smiled and gave a small wave before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Henry alone on the bench once more. But this time the loneliness didn't feel quite as heavy. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The days passed slowly after the incident in the square. Henry found himself replaying the moment over and over in his mind, but now it was Mason's words that lingered more than the humiliation. Each morning, he walked the same route through the park, passing by the cafe where the group of young men often gathered. They hadn't bothered him again, but that didn't stop the looks, the dismissive glances from strangers who saw only an old man out of step with the world around him. Henry's house, once full of life and laughter, was now a quiet, empty place. The sound of Evelyn's voice had long since faded from the walls, replaced by the ticking of the grandfather clock she had insisted on buying years ago. He used to think the ticking was comforting, a steady reminder of time passing. Now, it felt more like a countdown. His children, Michael and Susan, called every now and then, but their lives were busy. They had families of their own, jobs that kept them occupied. He didn't blame them. Life moved on, as it always did. But the loneliness was a weight he carried with him every day, a weight he had grown accustomed to over the years. Still, Mason's promise had stuck with him. There was something in the way the man had spoken, something that made Henry believe, even if only for a moment, that maybe things could be different. One afternoon, as Henry sat in his armchair staring at the television, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting visitors. Slowly, he made his way to the door, his joints stiff from the years of wear. When he opened the door, there stood Mason, a smile on his face. "Hope I'm not bothering you," Mason said, holding up a paper bag. "I brought lunch." Henry blinked, momentarily stunned. He hadn't had a visitor in weeks, and certainly not one bringing lunch. Mason stepped inside, setting the bag down on the kitchen table. "Thought we could catch up." Henry followed him, feeling a mix of surprise and gratitude. As they sat down to eat, the silence between them was comfortable, like they had known each other for longer than just a few days. Mason leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what we talked about in the square." Henry raised an eyebrow. And I think it's time people start treating you with the respect you deserve." Henry chuckled. "I'm not sure there's much anyone can do about that." Mason leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination. "You'd be surprised." And so, without Henry realizing it, the plan began to take shape. Days turned into weeks, and Mason became a regular presence in Henry's life. He showed up on random afternoons, always with lunch or coffee in hand, and together they would sit and talk about life, the past, and the future. For the first time in years, Henry found himself looking forward to something. The loneliness wasn't gone, but it felt less oppressive, like a weight that had been lifted just enough for him to breathe easier. But it wasn't just the conversation. Mason had a spark of something Henry hadn't seen in years, a determination to make things right. He wasn't just a man passing through Henry's life, he had a plan. And though Henry was skeptical at first, Mason's energy was infectious. "So, here's what I'm thinking," Mason said one afternoon as they sat in Henry's living room, the afternoon sun filtering through the window. "Those guys in the square? They think they can get away with treating people like garbage because no one ever stands up to them. They've never faced any real consequences." Henry shifted in his chair, raising an eyebrow. "And what do you propose?" "I'm 90 years old, Mason. I'm not exactly in a position to confront a bunch of kids." Mason smiled, leaning forward. "That's the beauty of it. You won't have to. We're going to set the stage, let them walk right into it, and when they do, they'll get a surprise they'll never forget." Henry frowned, unsure of what Mason meant. "What are you planning?" Mason leaned back, his grin widening. "You'll see, but trust me on this, it's going to be good." Henry wasn't convinced, but there was something about the way Mason spoke that gave him a sense of hope, even if only for a moment. Maybe it was his own exhaustion with how the world had treated him lately, or maybe it was the idea of getting some form of dignity back. Either way, he was willing to listen. A week later, Mason knocked on Henry's door again, this time with a more serious look on his face. "It's time." Henry blinked, not entirely sure what Mason meant. "Time for what?" "For you to get your dignity back," Mason said, holding out a folded piece of paper. "We're going to the square again, and this time things will be different." Henry unfolded the paper and looked at the address. It was a cafe near the square, the same one where the group of young men had humiliated him weeks before. His stomach churned at the memory, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" Henry asked, his voice wary. Mason smiled. "Just show up, and I'll take care of the rest." Henry wasn't sure what Mason was up to, but he trusted him. For the first time in years, he felt like someone was on his side. The cafe was bustling with people when Henry arrived, a mix of young professionals, tourists, and locals enjoying their afternoon coffee. The group of young men, Henry's tormentors, were there, just as Mason had said they would be. They were seated outside, laughing loudly, oblivious to the world around them. Henry felt his chest tighten. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep unease. He hadn't wanted to return to this place, but something in Mason's eyes had convinced him to come. Mason met him outside the cafe, dressed in casual clothes, but with an air of quiet confidence. He gave Henry a reassuring nod. "You ready?" Henry wasn't sure if he was, but he nodded anyway. Mason stepped forward, positioning himself near the group of young men. He glanced around the square, as if waiting for something, and then it happened. A tall, broad-shouldered man approached the cafe, his movements deliberate. He looked to be in his early 40s, with the posture of someone who had seen combat. He walked straight up to the table where the young men were seated and stood silently for a moment. The laughter at the table faded as the man's presence registered. The leader of the group, the same young man who had humiliated Henry, looked up, his smirk fading. "Can we help you?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, much like the one Mason had given Henry. He handed it to the young man. "What's this?" the young man asked, his tone suddenly less confident. The man finally spoke, his voice low and authoritative. "That's the record of Henry Carson's service in the military. He fought for this country long before you were born. He's a war hero." The young man blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" The man's voice didn't waver. "You humiliated him in public. You disrespected a man who has given more to this world than you could possibly imagine." The cafe had grown silent now, with patrons and bystanders watching the scene unfold. Mason stood nearby, his arms crossed, a satisfied smile on his face. Henry watched from a distance, unsure of what to do. The young man looked down at the paper in his hands, his face paling. I didn't know." "That's the problem," the man said, his tone growing harder. "You don't know, but now you do." The young man's friends sat in stunned silence, not daring to speak. The leader looked up, his bravado gone. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words barely audible. The man didn't move. "You should apologize to him, not to me." The young man stood, his head hanging low, and turned toward Henry, who had remained on the edge of the square. The crowd parted as he approached, the weight of his shame evident in his every step. "I'm sorry," the young man said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean—" Henry stared at him for a long moment, his heart pounding. The apology felt hollow, but there was something in the young man's eyes that made him believe it was genuine. "It's not about who I am," Henry said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's about how you treat people. You don't need to know someone's past to show them respect." The young man nodded, his head still bowed. "You're right. I'm sorry." Henry looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at Mason, at the stranger who had come to his defense. He could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of everyone on him, but this time it didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like vindication. "I accept your apology," Henry said softly, and with those words the young man turned and walked back to his table, his friends following him in silence. As the young man walked away, the silence in the square remained. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. They lingered, their eyes shifting between Henry and the stranger who had come to his defense. Mason stepped forward, standing beside Henry. "You okay?" Henry nodded, though he wasn't sure what to feel. There was a part of him that wanted to be angry that it had taken a public shaming for the young men to understand respect. But another part of him, a much quieter part, felt a sense of peace. The stranger, the man who had revealed Henry's history, approached them. "I hope I wasn't too forward," he said, his voice much softer now. Henry shook his head. "You did more than I could have asked for. Thank you." The man nodded. "The name's Ryan. I served in the military too. When Mason told me what had happened, I knew I had to help." Mason smiled, giving Ryan a pat on the shoulder. "Told you it would work." Henry looked between the two men, a quiet gratitude blooming in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. People had seen him, truly seen him, and they had stood by him. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people approached Henry, offering words of thanks and admiration for his service. It was overwhelming, but in a way that made him feel like he was part of the world again, not just a relic of the past. And, for the first time in a long time, Henry allowed himself to smile, a real, genuine smile. The days following the incident in the square were different. Henry walked through town with a newfound sense of dignity, no longer shrinking away from the stares of passers-by. People greeted him now, not just with the casual nods of acknowledgement, but with words of respect. Mason continued to visit him regularly, and their conversations grew deeper. They talked about life, about regret, about the things that truly mattered, and Henry found that the weight he had carried for so long, the loneliness, the bitterness, had started to lift. He still missed Evelyn, still thought of her every day. But now, when he thought of her, it wasn't with the same sense of loss. It was with gratitude for the life they had shared. As for the group of young men who had humiliated him, they kept their distance, though Henry would occasionally catch them glancing his way, their expressions a mix of respect and shame. They had learned their lesson, and that was enough. Mason's plan had worked. But more than that, it had given Henry something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of closure and a reminder that dignity wasn't something you lost with age. It was something you carried with you, no matter what the world thought. And so, with each passing day, Henry lived not just as an old man, but as a man who had lived, a man with a legacy, a man with a story worth telling. If you've ever felt overlooked, disrespected, or forgotten, remember Henry's story. Sometimes, the respect we deserve is closer than we think. It just takes the right moment and the right people to bring it back into the light. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more heartwarming and inspirational tales that remind us of the power of dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right.